When Jesus ruined my life, week 4, this is the grand finale, though I could have kept this thing going. I don't know if you've had as good of a time listening as I've had writing these things. But the basic premise is that we've been looking at people in the Bible who had a physical encounter with Jesus. And in Paul's case, he had a spiritual encounter with Jesus, and that it ruined all of the plans that they had for their lives. And that is my testimony. And today we're going to do something that we haven't done in the last 4 weeks. We're going to be looking at 2 different characters, and we're going to compare and contrast their lives, their encounter with Jesus, and then what their consequence, the life, excuse me, I speak for a living, the life that they lived after that and the consequences of their decision with Jesus. We're going to be looking today at Matthew the tax collector and Nicodemus the Pharisee. Matthew the tax collector and Nicodemus the Pharisee, their 2 lives and how it was different. But what we have here is that we have 2 very different human beings with 2 very different backgrounds, 2 different lives, 2 different encounters with Jesus, but they had the same thing that we all have. The common denominator amongst all of us is that we are constantly wrestling with 2 questions. Do I matter? And does God really have a purpose for my life? And both of these men are the same. Now, let's talk about Matthew first. Who was Matthew? Interesting enough that Mark and Luke call Matthew by his real name, which is Levi. So sometimes you'll see Levi, but Matthew in his own gospel, he calls himself Matthew. Now here's the question, why is he known as Matthew rather than Levi? And we don't really know, but we can make an educated guess. Some of you can make an uneducated guess. And it really is probably one of 2 things. First is Jesus is in this business of giving people new names that represent a transformation. And then also the idea is that Matthew, much like Zacchaeus, was a Jew who was a tax collector working for the Roman Empire. So the other chance is that Matthew was his Roman name. Now, Tebble, who plays bass up here, she's a math teacher, and she said he changed his name to Matthew because he was a tax collector and he liked math. That was a test. If that joke went well, I'm going to say it in the 3rd service and not give Tebble any credit. If it went poorly, which it did, I'm going to tell them that it was Tebble's joke. That's called hedging your bets, ladies and gentlemen. Matthew was a lot like Zacchaeus. A few weeks ago, if your church attendance is fantastic, we went through the story of Zacchaeus, and I told you about how terrible it was to be a tax collector if you were Jewish during this time. Because just like Zacchaeus, Matthew was a Jew who worked for the Roman Empire, taking money from the Jews. So he was hated, he was despised, he was ostracized, and he was considered spiritually disgusting. Because you would take money from God's people and give it to the empire that is literally persecuting Christians. And so you have to understand Matthew's state of mind. He was hated. He was also a genius. See, he was a tax collector in Capernaum, the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. So in this region, to be a tax collector, he would have had to have spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Some of you Southerners can barely speak English correctly. He speaks all 3 of those languages. He also, by the way, would have been a mathematical genius because he had to figure out percentages, lien on your property. If you owed taxes last year and had to pay interest, he had to do all of this in real time. No TurboTax, no QuickBooks, not even the math calculator as the app on your iPhone. If you're saved. If you're unsaved, on your Android. Now, I'm being serious about that. What did Matthew look like? If you're anything like me, every time we hear somebody's name in the Bible, we think he's an old man with a beard. This is how people view Matthew many times. And there's no doubt that Matthew probably looked like this. I see Gandalf. But he probably looked something like this, but it probably was years later. But when Jesus recruited Levi, he would have looked something a lot more like this. Historically, he would probably had to have been around ages 16 to 23, most likely closer to his teens. And Matthew records his first encounter with Jesus for us, so we don't even have to guess. He writes it firsthand. Matthew 9:9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. In one verse, that tells you his encounter with Jesus. It didn't even take another verse for him to turn away from everything he had and just simply follow Jesus. He had a lot to stake, man, a lot at stake. He had a pretty financially successful thing going on. And in one verse, he says Jesus came up to him at the booth, said, "Follow me." And Matthew said, "Yep." If somebody is writing the story of Jason's life, my goal is to have as many of the stories of God asked Jason to do blank and Jason did it. Because I have way too many verses instead that says God asked Jason to do this, and then he didn't, and then he didn't, and then he didn't. And then when everything got messed up and he exhausted all of his resources, he repented and said, "Okay, God, whatever you say." How will they tell your story? That God asked something of you that would cost something, and you said, "No problem. You got it." One verse. Now, here's another important part. Jesus goes to Matthew, it says, at the tax collector's booth. Here's an artist's rendition of what this would have looked like. So this is super important because Matthew's sitting at his booth. This is where you would come to pay your taxes. Tax collectors weren't just despised. They were considered spiritually unclean, the worst of the worst, vile. And the place where business was done was also unclean, vile. No respectable Jew would be seen at this booth. So you would do one of two things. You would send somebody in your place to go pay your taxes for you, or you would go do it as quick as possible because I don't want to be seen here. I'm going to wrap my face up so nobody notices me. Let's get this business done and let's get out of here. It's kind of like every time I go to the DMV. Because they didn't even want to be seen at a place where vile, disgusting, unclean things were done. Yet, Jesus goes here in the middle of the day, in the middle of a crowd, and tells Matthew, "I love you right where you are." This gives us a glimpse into the heart of my Savior. That Jesus will go to the places where you are that are unclean, that are dirty, that are vile, that are disgusting, and he will meet you right in the middle of your mess, in the middle of everybody, as if he has no shame, and he calls you by name. Every other religion in the world, mankind has to get the impurities out of them so they can enter into the presence of God. And in Christianity, it's God loved you so much, he sent Jesus to come down right in the middle of your sin. And it says, and he became sin so that we could become the righteousness of God. And I don't know about you, but I am thankful that in the middle of my mess, Jesus called me by name. And he still does. He goes to that booth. Now, this is going to be important because now I want you to see the dichotomy between his encounter and Nicodemus's. So who was Nicodemus? John 3:1. Now, there was a Pharisee, a man named Nicodemus, who was member of the Jewish ruling council. If your church attendance has been great this summer, we talked about Pilate, and the Jewish ruling council came to Pilate. And so we know the Jewish ruling council in Jerusalem, they were called a name, and I want to see if you know it. It starts with a san and ends with a hedron. Don't you wish I was your teacher in high school? The Sanhedrin. And Nicodemus was a part of this. Nicodemus was everything Matthew wasn't. Matthew sold his soul for money. Obvious sinner to everybody. Nicodemus was great at not sinning. At least outwardly. One doesn't just become a member of the Sanhedrin by happenstance. That's years of studying, had a blue check mark next to his name, had a following. When Nicodemus spoke, people gathered because they wanted to hear it. He had everything Matthew did, and people avoided Matthew at all costs. People wanted to just be in the room for Nicodemus. But Matthew was broken and knew what he needed. Nicodemus was broken and too prideful to know that he was broken. Notice the difference. Verse 2. He came to Jesus at night. Everybody say at night. Underline those two words. Write it down if you're taking notes. This is huge. He came to Jesus at night because his reputation was so important to him that he did not want anybody to see him talking to Jesus. Because what would they think? Too many of us have fallen for this trap that our relationship with God is supposed to be 100% private. I'm not doing anything publicly because it's my relationship. Understand that there are components of it that are supposed to be between you and God. But this thing from the very beginning is supposed to be outwardly. We're supposed to let our light shine, and some of you never leave your home and tell anybody about God. Do you meet Jesus at night? Listen to what he says. Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the signs you are doing if you were not with him. Jesus replied, very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again. Now here's that phrase, born again. And what Nicodemus is about to ask, I think is a really good question. Like imagine for a moment, if it's your first time ever being at a church of any kind. If it is, I'm so glad you're here. But even that phrase, born again, like that's what we call Christianese. Like that's weird, right? Imagine if you walk into a church, you've never been to church before, have no context whatsoever, and it's Communion Sunday. Or somebody gets up and says, together as a body of believers, we're going to eat the body of Jesus and drink his blood. And then we'll be born again. And you're like, what kind of weird cult vampire thing is going on? And so Nicodemus asks a very good question. What do you mean born again? Now there's a hint of sarcasm here. But listen to what Jesus asks. Or listen to what Nicodemus asks. He said, how can someone be born again when they are old? Surely they cannot enter a second time into their mother's womb. Now, there's a little cynicism in that question as well. Jesus answered, very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they are born of water and of spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but spirit gives birth to spirit. He said, you have been born, but your spirit has not been born again. You should not be surprised at me saying you must be born again. Jesus makes it very clear that this thing that's in vogue in society right now called universalism, meaning there are multiple paths to God, you cannot believe in that and believe in Jesus at the same time. He made it very clear there's only one way to the Father, and now it's through him. We're going to be talking about this a whole lot more in August. We have this series called TikTok Theology that we're going to be doing, talking about how people get terrible theology literally through TikTok videos, and this is one of them. There is only one way, and it's through Jesus. Here is a scene from a really old movie of Jesus and his interaction with Nicodemus. Now, Matthew has an encounter with Jesus, leaves right away. I'm here, I'm all in. And some of us are that way sometimes. Nicodemus is different. He has this encounter with Jesus, and it cost him too much. He wasn't willing to sacrifice his pride, his reputation, and all of the plans he had for his life. So he has an encounter with Jesus, and he does nothing about it. He goes back to his same life. Do you see the difference? So now let's talk about how this plays out. How did God use Matthew? How did he use Matthew? Matthew had immediate obedience. God uses Matthew in a few ways. The first one is his party. Listen, for those of you that were in fraternities and sororities, listen to this. God used Matthew throwing a party right away. Check this out. Matthew 9, 10 through 13. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, it's like right after it, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. Matthew throws a party right away, and he invites all of his vile, disgusting, sinful friends. I love hanging out with people who are new to this life of following Jesus. I love it. If you've been following Jesus for 20 plus years, I probably don't enjoy hanging out with you. That's the truth. Because in time, the default is the good news becomes old news. The miracle becomes mundane and monotonous. You want to be reminded of what it is like to be forgiven, be around a new convert. Because Matthew gets saved, he throws a big old party, and all of his friends probably show up thinking it's going to be a rager like all the other ones have. And instead he's like, hey, I need all of you to come here. You got to hear about Jesus. And listen to what happens. When the Pharisees, the church folk, when they saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. He says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. This is another glimpse into the heart of Jesus. Jesus is saying, I desire to give them forgiveness. He's obsessed with it. For I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners. I love that he uses Matthew right off the bat. Hey, I want you to throw a party like all the other ones that you have and invite all of the worst people in town and let me be there and let me love on them and let me offer them mercy. A party that church people would roll their eyes at. I believe that the people that Jesus would pursue would probably disgust most church people. They would be like, why would Jesus spend time with them? Because we've forgotten what it's like to be forgiven. Sometimes, I wasn't going to share this, by the way, until yesterday, and I felt the Spirit of God tell me now's the time to share it. But the Lord gives me prophetic visions sometimes. And I'm a Baptist, so this freaks me out when it happens. They don't happen as often as I would like, but it's not up to me when God gives me something. And a few months ago, I was in this season where I was just praying a lot. Lord, man, what do you want this church to look like? I got no business running this church, Lord, so what do you want it to look like? And I felt the Lord give me this vision. And it was at a park. And there was a little girl there, and she was feeding the ducks. And she had this bag of bread, and she was throwing it to the ducks. And right out in the front were these ducks that acted like they were starving. They were pushing other ducks out of the way, and they were paddling their little whatever feathers to get their mouth up as high as possible to grab whatever it was. And then over in the back, there was these fat ducks that were just floating around. They wanted to be a part of the group, but they were in the back. And this little girl is exhausting all of her energy trying to throw this bread to make it land to the fat ducks in the back. And it would land right next to them, and they would look at it so disinterested, maybe eat it if it was convenient, but really they were just floating around. And meanwhile, these little ones in the front were just fighting for it. And I felt the Lord tell me that I was the little girl, which is not what I would have chosen a man. Maybe a man that looks like John Cena, I don't know. Instead, he said, you're the little girl. And I'm like, well, it's 2025, anything goes, I guess. Very inappropriate. Inappropriate that you're laughing at it, actually. You're encouraging my terrible behavior. But he says, you're the little girl. The bread is the bread of life. And I don't want you to fall into the trap that too many preachers do, where they try so hard to get the uninterested ducks bread. I really felt the Lord tell me, and I'm not throwing this around lightly, feed the hungry ones. Feed the hungry ones. The hungry ones are the ones that show up when they don't have to. The hungry ones are saying, what more can I get? The hungry ones are saying, I want to be here no matter what. I've got to tell everybody I know about this. The hungry ones, the hungry ones. So I'm going to say something right now that is wildly unpopular. In fact, if I were to write a blueprint how to not grow a church, I would include this phrase that I'm about to say. If you're here and you've been coming for a while and you have no intention whatsoever of ever serving in this place, of ever financially giving in this place, of being part of inviting your friends to this place and reaching this community as if we were desperate, I want you in church, but not this church. I need seats for the hungry ones. I have no interest in this church being big. If God decides to grow it, so be it. But I want this church to not be a big church. I want it to be an impactful church. And I think we can all be a part of it. I went to visit my grandma this week. She's in her 90s. She's my best friend, besides Gerald. She's blind. She's been following the Lord for 8 decades. And she's got a nurse that comes once a week and helps prepare her meals, clean, whatever she needs. And she told me that this week when the nurse came, she said, I have some time. What do you need from me? And my grandma said, can you please read Isaiah 61 and just keep going till your time is up? Because I haven't read it or heard it in so long because she's blind. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a 92-year-old woman who is still a hungry one. May we be the hungry ones. The other way that he used Matthew was by how he wrote his gospel. He threw a party, and then years later, he had Matthew write a gospel. It's the first one, the book of Matthew. And here's what I love. This is another glimpse into the heart of who God is and how he redeems and uses. Are you ready? Each of the Gospels are written to a different person, a different people group. That's why they come from a different perspective. And Matthew, he's not writing to the Romans. He's not writing to the Greeks. He's not writing to the Gentiles. He's not writing to everybody like John is. Matthew writes to a very specific group of people. He spent years betraying his own people, the Jews. God forgives him, redeems him, transforms him. And then he says, Matthew, you're going to write part of my story, and you're going to write it to the very people that you betrayed, the Jews. That's why if you ever read Matthew chapter 1, you skip it probably, because the entire thing is so-and-so begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so, and you're like, who needs this, right? But Matthew did, because he knew that if he was going to write to the Jews and try to convince them that Jesus from Nazareth was the Messiah that they've been hearing about for centuries, the very first thing a Jew is going to say is, then show me that he's from the line of David. It's the first thing. So how's Matthew spend the first sentence of his gospel? This is another glimpse into the heart of God. Lean into this. I love God because he doesn't want a brand new factory reset, wrapped in cellophane version of Jason. He says, give me your wounds, your brokenness, the chips, the dings, the scratches, the scars. That's the version of Jason that I want. Then I'm going to send you to the very people that you did wrong to the very people that saw how you lived your life for so long, and that's where I want you to go. My mind goes to the woman at the well. When Jesus is like, hey, you've been with a lot of dudes, and everybody knows. So let me tell you about mercy and forgiveness that comes through me. And he forgives her, he heals her, he transforms her right there. And then she says, I got to follow you, Jesus. And he goes, no. You got to go back to your hometown and tell them what you've been forgiven of. That's how God uses Matthew. Now let's end it. How does God use Nicodemus? Does he ever reach Nicodemus? Because he has this encounter with Jesus and he leaves. It was too big of a price. Matthew leaves no problem. Sold his soul for money, walked away from money. Sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, it's easier to write a check for a ministry than to show up and go serve. I'll take both. We see a glimpse of it in John chapter 7, a small glimpse. They're at this council, and they're talking about Jesus, and Nicodemus actually stands up publicly for Jesus. It's barely, it's a baby step, but he does it. And then take us to Golgotha, where Jesus is hanging on a cross. Flesh ripped apart in such an extreme way that some historians said they could not tell if it was a human or an animal that was hanging on that cross. Keep in mind, this is Good Friday. They don't really know that Resurrection Sunday's coming. They've heard it. Guess who shows up? John chapter 19, verse 38. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. This is a beautiful picture to know that it's never too late to make a decision for Jesus. You could have wasted so much time, yet Jesus says, I'm going to give you another chance and another chance and another chance. And we see Nicodemus reject Jesus and go about his life, yet it's never too late. It's never too late. You are never so broke that Jesus can't fix it. You are never so vile and disgusting that Jesus says, I want nothing to do with you. And we see that with Nicodemus. How do we end this series? This series called When Jesus Ruined My Life. What is the end cap, the bookend? And it's this. The devil had plans for me. He had plans for a little Jason raised in a broken home, to have him in bondage and chains, to have him feeling less than. The enemy had plans for Jason and Jason's life for hell. Understand that Satan has plans for you to make you think you're less than, to make you think that you're too broke, to send you to eternity separated from God. That was the plan that the devil had for me. That was my life. And then Jesus ruined my life. And he said that I can be a co-heir to Jesus' life. And that is available for you and me. And it is a prayer away from a God who is anxious to spend time with you, has thoughts about you, is pretty much obsessed with you. But sometimes we allow the devil to convince ourselves that we are less than. And that's how we started this whole message. What the Bible tells you, that you are the head, not the tail. The Bible tells you that no weapon formed against you shall prosper, that you are a royal priesthood, a holy nation. It says in Ephesians that you are God's special possession. And I want you to leave today reminded of that Jesus can ruin your life in the best way possible. I believe there's a future version of yourself that you haven't met yet that you would never believe if we're the hungry ones. Thank you so much for watching this video. It truly is an honor to be able to spend a little bit of time with you. I want to encourage you, if you want to keep up with all of the latest things going on at Centerpoint Church, you can subscribe to this channel. You can hit that bell for alerts so that you won't miss anything. And most importantly, if this impacted you in any way, I want to hear about it. We want to celebrate with you. We want to serve you. So if you go to centerpointtn.com, click on Contact Us, and we can't wait to get connected with you.